all the parts have been glued together and all the holes have been drilled, so it's time to get the Drago ready for paint. Now, Wildman includes this beautiful translucent red fiberglass with their kits, and a lot of people fly the Wildman kits naked without paint, or they put a clear coat on to make the red fiberglass shine a little bit more. But I like to put a regular paint job on my rockets. So this one's going to get a single color of metallic black, and I'm going to use sticker shock vinyl to get the actual scheme on. So it should be a very simple paint job to do, just with one color. And using all black, I won't need to use a white base coat like I do with my other rockets that use brighter colors. But before I can get painting, I need to smooth out all the parts. Fortunately, with this being a fiberglass kit, there's not a whole lot of smoothing to do. There's no tube spirals to fill, and there's no wood grain to fill on the fins. However, I do want to smooth my fillets about as well as I can before I start laying some paint down. And to do that, what I do is I just take a dowel and wrap sandpaper around it. And I'll just go down the fillets here and smooth out the edges as good as I can. Try and get a nice radius on the edges so that when I lay the paint down, it looks nice and smooth with no jagged edges and no wavy lines on the fillets. Now, these are the biggest fillets that I've done, but the concept remains the same. Just make it smooth, make it feel good, and then once you put the paint on, it'll look good. So I'll get started. I've got 100 grit sandpaper on my dowel, and I'll use that to make a nice radius and smooth out the edges. Then I'll come back with hand with some higher grit sandpaper, probably 220, and then moving on to 320 and then 400. Then before I put primer on the rest of the rocket, I'm going to go over the entire thing with 400 just to rough up the fiberglass just a little bit to help the primer stick a little bit better. I got to remember to put masking tape over the threads of the motor retainer because I don't want to end up with paint on that, because you can actually activate the paint during flight and make the retainer difficult to get back off after the flight. So it takes some time to get the rocket ready, but as far as smoothing out the rocket goes, being a fiberglass kit, this is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So I'll get started with fillets. Now once I finish sanding all of the fillets, it's time to actually start laying down the primer on the rocket. There's two different systems that I've used that have worked pretty well with rockets. Most of my rockets I paint with Rust-Oleum, which is readily available at just about any hardware store and is generally pretty cheap for the amount of paint that you get. I like to use the automotive primer, which is sandable, and then I use a gloss white as a base coat, and then put whatever coat I want on top of the gloss white. In the case of this rocket, I would be using the just regular gloss black, and then I like to finish it off with Krylon gloss clear. I find the Krylon has a better nozzle than the Rust-Oleum and lays a nice clear down, which is compatible with the Rust-Oleum. I have had issues putting Krylon on top of Duplicolor. So in the case of this rocket, I'm using Duplicolor. So I'm using Duplicolor Scratch Filler Primer, a generic black metallic paint. This will be the color of the rocket. And then I'll finish it off with a clear gloss coat, also Duplicolor, perfect match. So this whole system works together really well. Now the big difference for me between the Rust-Oleum and the Duplicolor is that Rust-Oleum is an enamel and the Duplicolor is an acrylic lacquer. Where this comes into play is the recoat times and the windows that are needed between the coats. Rust-Oleum says recoat within 1 hour or after 48 hours. Duplicolor simply says wait 10 minutes between coats. So in the event of Rust-Oleum here, I can lay down a base color such as the white, but then before I can sand it, I have to wait at least 48 hours before sanding it and applying the new color. With Duplicolor, I simply wait 10 minutes, I can sand, and move on to the next color. So I can knock out a paint job much quicker with Duplicolor. Okay, well I've gone over all of the fillets, all of the fins, and the body tube with sandpaper, getting it ready for a first coat of primer. So what I'm going to do now is use some alcohol and clean up all the fiberglass dust all over the booster section here. Then I'm going to get the booster section attached to my tube that I use to support the booster section while painting. And then I'm going to wipe it down one more time just to get rid of all the fingerprint oils and any other dust that might have settled on the booster. Then I can start priming the booster. So I've shot my first coat of primer here, and I've given it some time to dry. And it's real nice when you put the primer on because it really shows where you need to smooth out some of the areas here. Much easier than looking at the bare parts. So what I'm going to do is go over the whole rocket with some 400 grit sandpaper and try and smooth out everything that I can using just the sandpaper. And whatever I need that's going to take a little bit more than sandpaper is going to get just a little bit of filler. It looks like I have a little tiny void here on this fillet here, so I'll fill that with a little bit of filler and a little bit right there too. And for the most part, it looks like everything else is pretty smooth. Maybe just a little filler right here. Then I'll go over that with sandpaper, smooth it out, and I'm going to give it another coat of primer and sand it again, and just keep repeating the process until the booster is nice and smooth. After the second coat of primer, I ran over the whole rocket with 600 grit sandpaper. I'm very happy with how it's turning out. Feels very smooth. It may not be perfect, but I kind of like the phrase, perfection is the enemy of good enough. And especially with rockets, when they come down, you don't know where they're going to come down. They could be hitting trees, they could land in the swamp, it could be hitting rocks, gravel, and so it seems that perfect paint jobs don't last very long with rockets. So I am pretty happy with how this is going to look. I think it's going to look great once I get the color on. And since I've smoothed out the primer as much as I'd like, it's finally time to put some paint on this thing. I've primed my payload tube already. Looks real nice. So just to get it ready for my, my coat of black paint, all I'm going to do is just take some 600 grit sandpaper and go over the entire tube and just smooth it out. The way the primer is right now feels just a little bit rough, and if it feels rough now, it's going to look rough later when I put the paint on. So I'll just get to work. Now, it's important to remember that the primer really does gum up the sandpaper when you're sanding it. To avoid that, or to minimize it, you can wait a bit longer to allow the primer to dry. But if you start sanding the primer right away, right after the instructions say it's okay to, chances are you're going to gum up your sandpaper real quick. I've given this body tube some time to dry, so I should only be able to use one pad of sandpaper. So I'll get it feeling nice and smooth, and then I'll put on the coat of paint. Okay, I've smoothed out the primer on the payload tube here, and I've wiped all the dust off of it, so it's ready for its first coat of paint. So I'm going to take it outside and spray it with my black. This is what I'm using. It's a Duplicolor, perfect match. It's just a generic metallic black. That's what I'm going to use on the entire rocket, and then for the color I'm just using vinyl from Sticker Shock. Should look pretty fantastic and pretty clean too, with the rocket being just in one color. Now normally if I'm going to use colors other than just all black for the rocket, I would start with a white base coat, and this makes the colors really pop. But since the rocket's all black, I'm just going to go straight from the gray primer to the black. So I'm going to get started painting the payload tube here. So I've gotten the first coat of paint down on the payload tube here. You can see it's nearly full coverage. I found that the heavier the coat, the smoother the paint ends up drying, but you don't want to go so heavy that you start getting runs. I find that if I go super light on the coats, that the paint ends up being pretty bumpy, and it takes a lot of sanding to make it look good. So according to the instructions on the can here, I should wait about 10 minutes at least before applying the second coat. So I'm going to do that, just wait about 10-15 minutes, I'll apply a second coat and see how the coverage looks. Alright, here's the payload tube with the second coat of black on. As you can see, it's a bit deeper black now. It's fully coated and it looks pretty good to me, so I'm going to let this dry overnight. Then I'll start with the clear coat tomorrow. So I've finally gotten all of the color on all of the parts of the rocket, as well as the clear coat applied. All of the parts look fantastic, and I can't wait to see how it looks all together with the final trim applied. Now for this rocket, I'm not going to use any other different paint colors for any of the trim. What I am going to use is some vinyl from a company called Sticker Shock. And that's who I use for just about all of my rocket kits. They have a number of different designs for different rockets, and some that are specifically made for certain rockets. This is one of them. This is called the Drago, and so I found a dragon-themed set for the Drago kit. So I can't wait to get started on applying that. Now the vinyl is one long piece that's going to span up the entire length of the rocket. So to apply it properly, what I'm going to do is assemble the entire rocket together and then lay out the vinyl on top of the rocket and apply it. So as I unrolled the vinyl wrap for the rocket here, I came to discover that the wrap is actually long enough that it's going to extend a little bit into the nose cone, which is actually pretty cool because it only extends just a little bit and it's just a small stripe, so I don't have to worry about the compound curves of the nose cone and cutting a relief slot or anything like that. And in addition, it'll help me line up the nose cone when I put the nose cone on while prepping the rocket for flight. Now I did put the rocket all together to lay the vinyl down, and in doing so I put in all of the shear pins and the bolts. So I know that the rocket is perfectly lined up, so once I do make the cuts after laying down the vinyl, I know that it'll line up just fine when I put the rocket back together again. Now some vinyl designs are easy enough to figure out where the center is and line it up perfectly on the rocket. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit more of an artistic design, and so it took just a combination of eyeballing it and a little bit of measuring, and I was able to find out a good straight line that parallels the design. Unfortunately, Mark printed up the design right next to the edge of the sheet, so I was able just to use the edge of the sheet as a guide. And I know that just due to the camera angle, I had a look there. It doesn't look like this line is quite straight, but as I put the design on, I checked it against my body tube line guide right here, and it's pretty darn straight going all the way up the rocket here. And I've had the rocket upright, staring at the design, just making absolutely sure that everything looks perfect. And as you can see from the masking tape here, I've pulled it off several times just to make small adjustments. So what I'm going to do now is put a larger piece of masking tape along the length of the vinyl design, just to make sure it's a nice, strong, straight line. And then I'm going to pull the vinyl up, and I'm going to clean the rocket, make sure there's no dust or debris or anything like that that's going to go between the vinyl and the body tube. Then I'm going to spray the water solution that Sticker Shock recommends, and I'll start laying down the vinyl on the rocket. So I've added a bigger piece of masking tape going up the vinyl decal here. Here's some of that solution that I made. That was just based on Sticker Shock's recommendations. It's just I guess just a water and soap mixture here. I made it a little while ago. Should still work fine. It just prevents air bubbles from getting trapped underneath the vinyl while I'm laying the vinyl down. It gives me a chance to just kind of spread the vinyl out, get rid of any bubbles, and then I can dab that solution with my paper towels here. So I've gone over the body tube here, made sure it's nice and clean, no dust underneath the vinyl design. So I'm going to just spray the solution right down the rocket here. You don't have to be shy with it. And I'm going to remove the backing on the vinyl design and then nice and carefully lay down the decal. Now I've had this vinyl design in my garage for a little while now, a little bit over a year actually, and as a result some of the backing has stuck to the back of the vinyl design, some of the little guys here, and all it takes to fix that is just running a little razor blade right between the backing and the vinyl decal, and it just comes right off. Okay, it took a little time to get all of the backing tape off, but the vinyl decal is ready to go onto the rocket, so I'm just going to spritz it one more time here with my water solution, and then I'll start laying it down. What I'm doing here is just starting from the middle, working my way out. This should help prevent wrinkles the best I can. Just go little by little. I should also mention that while I was laying out the vinyl design here and checking the fit, I was checking to see if any part of the design was going to lay across any bolt heads or any shear pin heads, and that might interfere with trying to get the design nice and straight. Fortunately it didn't, but if it did, I would just remove those bolts or shear pins and put tape on the joint where they were fastening the two surfaces. Okay, so I got the vinyl decal in place, and I sighted down the body tube one more time before I start removing the transfer tape here. This is my last chance to be able to try and just push the design for one little tweak in case it was off just a little bit, but I'm really happy with how it's looking. So I'm going to start removing the transfer tape here, and as I do so, I'm just going to push on the vinyl decals as I go and just make sure that all of the solution is pressed out from underneath so it's getting a nice stick on the body tube. I should mention that most of the decals that I put on my rockets are placed on before I do the clear coat, and I'll do the clear coat on top of the vinyl. However, in this case I'm using some chrome vinyl here, and so I didn't want the clear coat to go on top of the chrome and possibly dull the finish of the chrome. So in the case of this rocket, I put the clear coat down first with the vinyl decals on top. What I'm doing here is I'm breaking the transfer tape just so I can concentrate on one small portion of the decal at a time. And it makes the transfer tape a little bit more manageable as I'm getting rid of it. There we go. I can see that some of the vinyl is lifting up just a little bit, which means that there's still some solution underneath. So as I'm pulling the tape away, I'm just going to squeegee that solution out from underneath the vinyl. There's a lot of intricate detail in this design here, so I want to make sure that the vinyl is nice and secure before I pull the transfer tape away and start handling the rocket. There we go, I've got the last of the transfer tape off of the decal here, and I'm just working to smooth any little bubbles or tiny wrinkles that I might find. Fortunately, vinyl is pretty pliable, and it's easy enough to get rid of those little imperfections. Just get them pushed down against the rocket. Now that I'm messing with the decals here, I can tell that they're quite small and intricate and very pointy here, so very narrow and long. And what this means is that it might be possible for the wind to get underneath it and start ripping these things off when I fly the rocket. So I'll have to reconsider whether I want to put clear coat on top. Right now I'm thinking that it's probably worth diluting some of the clear and dulling it just a little bit to put some clear coat on top of the vinyl here, just to help protect it and hopefully keep it on the rocket as long as possible. Now the last thing that I'm going to do before standing the rocket upright is I'm going to replace the blade on my razor blade right here with a brand new blade, and I'm going to cut the vinyl on any break points on the rocket so I can pull the rocket apart again. To finish off the final decals on the Drago here, I've got one decal for each fin, and they're different letters. So each one's a slightly different dimension, but they're mostly about the same size. So what I've done is gone over all the decals here and found the center of them and created a parallel line for each one to help me align them onto the fin. Now this is one of those areas where you just want to do your best to figure out a good spot that's going to work for all the sizes of the decals. Once I did that with the first letter here, I drew the center line on where the decal rests. I wanted it halfway out on the fin, so this part was measured. And then for the height, it didn't really matter just as long as it works for all the different decals. So this is the height that I chose for the first letter here, and I've checked against the other decals. It should just work fine for all of the decals here. I made a mark on this piece of tape here, then measured the distance to the end of the fin here. So I'll be able to transfer all of these dimensions to the other fins so that the letters should sit at about the same height as you walk around the rocket and see all the different letters. So fortunately these decals are quite a bit smaller than the main decal, so they should go on quite a bit quicker. It's just a matter of laying each one down just right and making sure that they all look good against one another. So time to get to work. Let's get those put on. Alright, there was the last fin. Now it's just time to go over everything one last time just to make sure everything looks nice and smooth on all the decals. Then I'll remove the transfer tape and then let's have a look at the rocket and see how it looks. Well, here she is. There's a lot of work left to get done before it can fly, but the paint and the vinyl is all done. And I have to say it looks really fantastic. I'm super excited about how this turned out here. The metallic black looks great in the sunlight. The vinyl looks fantastic. The chrome is just amazing on this rocket. Yep, I'm super happy with how this turned out. The fillets all look real good. The rocket's 85 inches tall, so it's a little over 7 feet tall. Very imposing rocket. And I'm just thrilled with how it turned out. So it is time to get to work on the avionics, the electronics and all that. Do some charge testing. But I think for the next few minutes I'm just going to sit here and appreciate how good this rocket looks. Cannot wait to see it in the air.